The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day. At 28 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for 6 years, and his dedication was unmatched. His polished black boots gleamed in the early light, and his tall bearskin hat sat perfectly atop his head. But beneath his stoic exterior, Thomas carried a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Thomas came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father, Robert Mitchell, had worked in the same textile factory for 30 years before it closed down due to overseas competition. His mother, Sarah, cleaned offices in the evenings to make ends meet. Thomas had always dreamed of serving his country, and when the opportunity arose to join the Queen's Guard, he saw it as a chance to honor his family and provide them with the stability they had never known. The financial pressures at home had been mounting. His younger sister Emma needed money for university, and his parents' mortgage payments were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Thomas had been secretly sending most of his salary home, leaving himself with barely enough to cover his basic expenses in London. He shared a tiny flat with 3 other guards, sleeping on a mattress in the living room because he couldn't afford his share of a proper bedroom. On this particular morning, as Thomas took his position outside St. George's Chapel, he noticed unusual activity around the castle grounds. Staff members were bustling about with extra energy, and he could hear the distant sounds of preparation coming from the main courtyard. Word had quietly spread among the guard that young Prince George, now 10 years old, would be visiting with his parents, Prince William and Catherine, for a family gathering. Thomas had always found the young prince to be different from what the media portrayed. While tabloids often focused on royal protocol and formal appearances, Thomas had observed Prince George during previous visits. The boy was naturally curious, kind-hearted, and possessed a remarkable ability to notice things that adults often overlooked. Unlike many children his age who might be intimidated by the formal atmosphere of royal residences, Prince George seemed genuinely interested in the people who worked there. As the morning progressed, Thomas's mind wandered to the letter he had received the night before. It was from his sister Emma, expressing her gratitude for his support but also her concern about his well-being. She had somehow sensed that he was struggling financially, though he had never explicitly told her. The letter had moved him to tears, something that rarely happened to someone trained to maintain composure under all circumstances. The weight of his responsibilities felt overwhelming. As a royal guard, he was expected to be the picture of strength and reliability. His uniform represented centuries of tradition and unwavering service to the crown. Yet inside, he felt like he was drowning in financial stress and personal sacrifice. He had considered taking a second job, but the demanding schedule of royal duties made that nearly impossible. He had also thought about asking for additional shifts, but those opportunities were limited and highly competitive among the guards. Thomas's concentration was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. A senior officer was making his rounds, inspecting each guard's appearance and positioning. Thomas straightened his posture even more, if that were possible, and focused his gaze straight ahead. The inspection passed without incident, but Thomas noticed the officer's slight nod of approval, a small recognition that meant more to him than he cared to admit. As midday approached, the castle grounds became more active. Thomas could see gardeners putting finishing touches on flower arrangements, and housekeeping staff ensuring every surface gleamed. The anticipation of the royal family's arrival created an atmosphere of heightened attention to detail. Every staff member understood that their work contributed to the seamless operation of one of Britain's most important institutions. Despite his personal struggles, Thomas took pride in his role. He understood that he was not just standing guard, but was part of a living piece of history. The walls around him had witnessed centuries of British history, from medieval times through 2 world wars and into the modern era. Kings and queens had walked these paths, and he was now entrusted with their protection and the preservation of these traditions. The irony was not lost on him that while he protected one of the world's wealthiest families, he could barely afford to eat proper meals. His breakfast that morning had consisted of a piece of toast and instant coffee, the same meal he had eaten for the past 2 weeks. He had learned to ignore the hunger pangs that often struck during his long shifts. viewing them as another test of his endurance and commitment. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Thomas heard the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching the main entrance. His pulse quickened slightly, not from nervousness but from the automatic heightening of alertness that came with his training. Every guard on duty would now be operating at maximum awareness, their senses tuned to detect anything out of the ordinary. The royal convoy passed through the gates with practiced precision, and Thomas caught a glimpse of the familiar figures inside the vehicles. Prince William waved briefly to the staff who had gathered to welcome the family, and Thomas could see Prince George's face pressed against the window, his eyes wide with excitement as he took in the familiar sights of Windsor Castle. What Thomas couldn't have known at that moment was that his life was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. The young prince in that vehicle possessed not only royal status but also an extraordinary capacity for empathy and observation. Prince George had a gift for seeing beyond surfaces and recognizing when people around him needed help, even when they tried their hardest to hide it. As the vehicles disappeared toward the main residence, Thomas returned his attention to his duties, unaware that within hours, 5 simple words from a 10-year-old prince would transform his life and restore his faith in the power of human kindness. The stage was set for an encounter that would demonstrate that true nobility comes not from titles or wealth, but from the courage to care about others when they need it most. Prince George had always been different from other children his age, though few people outside the royal family truly understood the depth of his character. While his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, were more typical in their childhood concerns and interests, George possessed an unusual awareness of the world around him. This sensitivity had been evident from an early age, much to the amazement of his parents and grandparents. During his early childhood, George had shown remarkable empathy toward the staff at various royal residences. While other children might run past servants and guards without a second thought, George would stop to ask about their families, remember their names, and show genuine interest in their lives. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had often remarked privately to Prince William that George reminded her of his great-grandfather, King George VI, who had been known for his deep concern for ordinary people. On this particular visit to Windsor Castle, George had been looking forward to exploring the grounds and spending time with his great-grandmother before her passing. The castle held special memories for him, and he had always felt a strong connection to its history and the people who worked there. His parents had taught him from an early age that the royal family existed to serve the people, not the other way around. And this lesson had taken root deeply in his young mind. As the royal family settled into their quarters, George found himself drawn to the windows overlooking the grounds where the guards were stationed. He had always been fascinated by the guards, not because of their colorful uniforms or ceremonial role, but because of their unwavering dedication. He understood, even at his young age, that these men and women stood for hours in all kinds of weather, protecting his family and maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries. During previous visits, George had noticed subtle differences among the guards. Some carried themselves with the confidence that comes from financial security and family stability. Others, however, showed signs of strain that most adults would miss entirely. George had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions and circumstances, a skill that often surprised even his parents. That afternoon, as George accompanied his father on a walk through the castle grounds, he specifically asked to take the route that would pass by the guard positions. Prince William, accustomed to his son's interest in the working staff, agreed readily. As they walked, George observed each guard carefully, his young mind processing details that others might overlook. When they approached Thomas Mitchell's position near St. George's Chapel, George immediately sensed something different about this particular guard. While Thomas maintained perfect military posture and the stoic expression required by protocol, George noticed subtle signs of distress. The guard's hands, though properly positioned, showed slight tension. His breathing, while controlled, seemed shallow, most tellingly to George's observant eyes. There was a sadness in the guard's gaze that spoke of struggles beyond the physical demands of his duty. George had learned to trust his instincts about people, and something about this guard stirred a deep sense of concern in him. He made a mental note of the guard's face and position, planning to find a way to learn more about his situation. This decision would prove to be the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events. Later that evening, during dinner with his family, George found himself distracted by thoughts of the guard he had seen. His parents noticed his unusual quiet demeanor and asked if anything was troubling him. George, wise beyond his years, explained that he had seen someone who looked sad and wondered if there was anything they could do to help. Prince William and Catherine exchanged glances, proud of their son's compassionate nature, but also aware of the complexities involved in royal family members intervening in staff members' personal lives. That night, George couldn't sleep easily. His room in Windsor Castle was comfortable and secure, but his mind kept returning to the image of the troubled guard. He had been taught that with privilege comes responsibility, and he felt a growing conviction that he needed to do something to help. This feeling was not driven by a child's whim, but by a genuine understanding of his position and its potential for positive impact. The next morning, George woke early and asked his protection officer if he could visit the chapel gardens before breakfast. This was not an unusual request, as George often enjoyed quiet moments in the beautiful outdoor spaces of royal residences. What was different this time was his specific interest in timing his visit to coincide with the changing of the guard. As George walked through the gardens with his protection officer maintaining a respectful distance, he observed the guards taking their positions for the day. Once again, he spotted Thomas Mitchell, and his concern deepened. Even from a distance, George could see that the guard looked tired, and his uniform, while impeccably maintained, showed signs of being stretched to last longer than typical. Replacement schedules would suggest George had grown up, understanding that many people worked hard to maintain the lifestyle and security his family enjoyed. His parents had been careful to teach him and his siblings about the value of work and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. However, George was beginning to understand that respect and dignity, while important, might not be enough when someone was facing serious difficulties. His young mind began formulating a plan. George knew that direct intervention might embarrass the guard or create complications within the established protocols of royal household management. However, he also knew that his unique position gave him opportunities that others didn't have. He could observe, learn, and perhaps find a way to help that would preserve everyone's dignity while addressing the underlying problem. During breakfast with his family, George listened carefully as his parents discussed their schedule for the day. He learned that they would be meeting with various staff members and reviewing household operations. This gave George an idea, and he began to develop a strategy that would allow him to learn more about the guard situation without violating any protocols or creating awkward situations. George's plan involved asking seemingly innocent questions about the guard's working, conditions and welfare, programs during the family's meetings with senior staff. He hoped to gather information that would help him understand not only this particular guard situation, but also whether there might be others facing similar challenges. His approach demonstrated a level of strategic thinking remarkable for someone his age. As the morning progressed, George found opportunities to engage various staff members in conversation. His natural charm and genuine interest in people made these interactions feel comfortable and natural. Through these conversations, he began to piece together a picture of the financial pressures facing some of the younger guards, particularly those who came from modest backgrounds and were supporting families back home. The information George gathered painted a concerning picture. While the guards were proud of their service and generally well treated, their salaries were modest, and many faced significant financial pressures. Some were supporting elderly parents, others were helping siblings through university, and still others were trying to save for their own futures while managing the high cost of living in London and the surrounding areas. This revelation strengthened George's resolve to help, but it also made him realize that the solution needed to be more comprehensive than simply helping one individual. He began to envision a way to address the broader issue, while still focusing on the specific guard who had initially caught his attention. Little did anyone know that George's compassionate observation and growing plan would soon lead to a moment that would change everything. The third day of the royal family's visit to Windsor Castle dawned with an unusual chill in the air. Thomas Mitchell had barely slept the night before, his mind consumed with worry about a phone call he had received from his sister Emma. She had tried to sound cheerful, but Thomas could hear the strain in her voice as she explained that their parents' situation had worsened. His father had been diagnosed with a serious health condition that would require expensive treatment, not fully covered by the National Health Service. Emma had assured Thomas that the family would manage somehow, but he knew better. His parents had always been proud people who would never ask for help, even when they desperately needed it. They had sacrificed so much to give their children opportunities they never had, and now it was Thomas's turn to sacrifice for them. The problem was that he was already giving everything he could, and it wasn't enough. As Thomas took his position that morning, his usual composure was tested to its limits. The weight of his family's needs pressed down on him like a physical burden, making it difficult to maintain the perfect stillness required of his role. He had spent years training his mind to focus solely on his duties while on guard, but today his concentration kept drifting to impossible calculations of how he might find additional money. Meanwhile, Prince George had spent the previous evening in deep conversation with his parents about the guards and their working conditions. His questions had been so thoughtful and persistent that Prince William and Catherine realized their son was not simply making casual inquiries. They recognized the signs of their eldest child's deep concern for others, a trait that both filled them with pride and occasionally caused them worry about the burden he placed on himself. George had asked his parents about the history of the royal guard system, how guards were selected, what their career progression looked like, and how the royal household ensured their well-being. His parents had answered as honestly as they could, explaining that while the royal household tried to be a good employer, the reality was that many guards came from modest backgrounds and faced financial pressures that their salaries, while fair by military standards, couldn't always address. This conversation had only strengthened George's determination to help, but it had also made him realize that he needed to be very careful about how he approached the situation. Any direct intervention from a member of the royal family could have unintended consequences, potentially embarrassing the guard or creating complications within the household's carefully structured hierarchy. That morning, George had requested permission to accompany his father to a scheduled meeting with the captain of the guard and other senior security personnel. This meeting was meant to review security protocols and discuss any concerns about the upcoming public appearances. George's presence at such meetings was not unprecedented, as his parents believed in gradually introducing him to the responsibilities he would one day inherit. During the meeting, George listened intently as discussions covered staffing levels, training programs, and general welfare concerns. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, George asked a question that surprised everyone in the room. Are there ways for guards who might be having difficult times at home to get extra help without it affecting their jobs? The question was so mature and thoughtful that the senior officers exchanged glances before the captain of the guard provided a careful answer. He explained that there were some support systems in place, but that many guards were reluctant to use them for fear of appearing unable to handle their responsibilities. He also acknowledged that the formal support systems might not always be adequate for the various challenges that guards faced. George nodded thoughtfully and asked a follow-up question. What if someone wanted to help in a way that wasn't official, so nobody would feel embarrassed or worried about their job? This question caused an even longer pause, as the adults in the room began to understand that the young prince was not asking hypothetical questions but was clearly thinking about a specific situation. Prince William gently asked his son if he had noticed someone who seemed to need help, and George confirmed that he had. He described his observations of Thomas Mitchell without naming him specifically, explaining that he had seen signs of sadness and stress that reminded him of how he himself felt when he was worried about something important. The sincerity and maturity of George's concerns moved everyone in the room. After the meeting, Prince William had a private conversation with his son. He praised George for his compassion and observation skills, but also explained the delicate nature of the situation. Direct intervention could create complications, and any help offered needed to preserve the dignity of the person receiving it. However, Prince William also assured George that they would find a way to help, because that was part of their responsibility as members of the royal family. That afternoon, while George was having tea with his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, he shared his concerns with her. The Queen, despite her advanced age, remained sharp and deeply interested in the welfare of those who served the royal family. She listened to George's observations, with growing amazement at her great-grandson's insight and compassion Queen Elizabeth had decades of experience in dealing with delicate situations involving staff members. She understood better than anyone how to provide help in ways that preserved dignity and avoided creating awkwardness or resentment. She also recognized that George's involvement in finding a solution was important for his own development as a future king who would need to balance formal protocol with genuine human concern. Queen suggested that George might consider a direct approach, but one that was carefully planned and executed in a way that would feel natural rather than like charity. She explained that sometimes the most effective help came not from grand gestures, but from simple human connections that acknowledged someone's worth and created opportunities for them to succeed on their own terms. As evening approached, George had formed a clear plan. He would find a way to speak directly with Thomas Mitchell, but he would do so in a context that felt appropriate and natural. He would not offer charity, but instead would create an opportunity for connection and understanding. Most importantly, he would speak from his heart, trusting that sincerity and genuine concern would guide him toward the right words. That night, as Thomas completed his shift and prepared to return to his cramped living quarters, he had no idea that a 10-year-old prince was lying awake in the castle, planning an intervention that would soon change his life. George had decided that tomorrow would be the day he would act, and he spent the quiet hours before dawn mentally preparing for what he knew would be one of the most important conversations of his young life. The stage was now set for an encounter that would demonstrate the power of genuine human compassion to transcend social boundaries and create meaningful change. Neither Thomas nor George fully understood what was about to happen, but both were about to discover that sometimes the most profound help comes from the most unexpected sources, and that true nobility reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of human kindness. The fourth morning of the royal visit brought with it a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang in the air like morning mist. Thomas Mitchell had received another phone call from home the previous evening, this one from his mother. She had tried to hide her tears, but Thomas could hear them in her voice as she explained that the medical bills were mounting faster than they had anticipated. His father's condition required specialist treatment that would cost thousands of pounds, money that the family simply didn't have. Thomas had assured his mother that he would find a way to help, though he had no idea how he would manage it. He had already applied for every possible overtime shift and had even considered selling his few personal possessions of value. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. He spent his days protecting one of the wealthiest families in the world, while his own family faced financial ruin. As Thomas took his position that morning near St. George's Chapel, he noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. This was deeply concerning to him, as physical control was fundamental to his role as a guard. He took several deep breaths and focused on his training, forcing his body to return to the rigid stillness required of his position. However, the emotional turmoil continued to rage beneath his controlled exterior. Prince George had woken that morning with a clear sense of purpose. He had spent much of the night thinking about his conversation with Queen Elizabeth and planning exactly how he would approach the guard who had captured his concern. George understood that this interaction needed to feel natural and unforced, but he also knew that he couldn't let another day pass without taking action. During breakfast with his family, George announced that he would like to spend some time that morning walking in the chapel gardens and possibly visiting St. George's Chapel itself. His parents agreed readily, as they were pleased to see their son taking such interest in the historical and spiritual aspects of Windsor Castle. What they didn't realize was that George had chosen this location specifically because it would allow him to naturally encounter Thomas Mitchell. Around mid-morning, George set out for his walk, accompanied by his personal protection officer, who maintained a discreet distance that would allow the prince some privacy while ensuring his security. George had specifically requested this arrangement, explaining that he wanted to spend some quiet time in reflection, which was not uncommon for him and was something his parents encouraged. As George approached the area where Thomas was stationed, he could see immediately that something was wrong. Even from a distance, the guard's posture seemed more rigid than usual, as if he were using physical control to contain inner turmoil. George's heart went out to him, and he felt a strong conviction that today was indeed the right time to act. George approached Thomas slowly, giving the guard time to notice him and adjust his attention appropriately. When he was close enough to speak in a normal voice, George stopped and looked directly at Thomas with the kind of open, honest expression that children possess when they are speaking from their hearts. "Good morning," George said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that was genuine and unaffected. "I'm Prince George, but I think you probably know that already." Thomas, following proper protocol, maintained his forward gaze and responded with a respectful, "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." However, something in the young prince's tone made him want to look down and make eye contact, even though his training dictated otherwise. George seemed to understand this dilemma and continued speaking in a way that didn't require Thomas to break protocol. "I've been watching you over the past few days," George said, "and I can tell that you're really good at your job. You stand so still and strong even when it's cold or when you must be tired." Thomas felt a flutter of surprise at the prince's observation. He had not expected such personal attention from any member of the royal family, least of all from a 10-year-old child. There was something in George's voice that suggested this was not idle conversation, but something more meaningful. "I've also noticed," George continued, his voice becoming gentler, "that you look sad sometimes. I don't mean to be nosy, but when I'm sad it usually means something difficult is happening that I can't fix by myself." These words hit Thomas with unexpected force. The idea that this young prince had not only noticed his distress but had taken the time to think about it and approach him personally was almost overwhelming. Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure begin to waver, and he struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. George, with the intuitive wisdom that sometimes comes naturally to children, seemed to sense Thomas's internal struggle. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know you're working and have to follow rules about how you stand and where you look, but I wanted you to know that I see you as a person, not just as a uniform." The simple sincerity of this statement nearly brought tears to Thomas's eyes. In all his years of service, he had received plenty of acknowledgement for his professional performance, but no one had ever recognized him as an individual human being with his own concerns and struggles. The fact that this recognition came from a child made it even more powerful. George paused for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "My great-grandmother told me something yesterday that I think is really important. She said that sometimes when people are serving others, they forget to take care of themselves or they can't figure out how to get help when they need it." Thomas found himself holding his breath, wondering where this conversation was leading. The prince's words were striking remarkably close to his exact situation, and he began to wonder if somehow his circumstances had become known to the royal family through official channels. "I don't know if you need help with anything," George continued, "but if you do, I want you to know that asking for help doesn't make you weak or bad at your job. It just makes you human." The compassion in the young prince's voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt something inside him begin to break open. For months he had carried his burdens alone, convinced that admitting his struggles would somehow compromise his position or his reputation. The idea that a member of the royal family, even a young one, would see his humanity and offer understanding rather than judgment was transformative. George then said something that would change everything. "Would you like to talk about it?" These 5 simple words, spoken with genuine care and concern by a 10-year-old prince to a struggling royal guard, created a moment that transcended all the usual boundaries of protocol, social class, and formal relationships. In that instant, Thomas felt truly seen and valued as a human being for the first time in months. The impact of those 5 words, "Would you like to talk about it?" reverberated through Thomas's consciousness like a bell. Someone cared enough to ask. Someone had noticed his pain and was offering him the most precious gift possible, the opportunity to be heard and understood. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized that this young prince, who could have been thinking about games or toys or any of the countless privileges available to him, had instead chosen to notice a struggling guard and offer him kindness. It was a moment of grace that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. The moment after Prince George spoke, those 5 transformative words hung in the air like a bridge between 2 worlds. Thomas Mitchell felt his carefully constructed professional facade beginning to crumble, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen by another human being. For several seconds neither spoke, as the weight of the prince's offer settled into the space between them. Thomas struggled with protocol and procedure. His training had taught him to maintain strict boundaries between his personal life and his professional duties. Guards were expected to be invisible in their humanity, present only as symbols of protection and tradition. Yet here was a 10-year-old prince who had somehow seen through that invisibility and was offering something Thomas hadn't received in months: genuine human compassion. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas began, his voice slightly strained with emotion. I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to discuss personal matters while on duty." George nodded understandingly. "You're right about being on duty," he said thoughtfully. "But what if we weren't talking while you were working? What if we could find another time when you weren't wearing your uniform, and I wasn't being Prince George in an official way?" The suggestion surprised Thomas. The idea that a member of the royal family would want to spend time with him as a person, rather than as a servant, was almost incomprehensible. Yet the sincerity in the young prince's voice made it clear that this was not a casual offer, but a genuine desire to help. George seemed to sense Thomas's confusion and continued, "I know this might seem strange. I'm only 10, and you're a grown-up with a really important job. But sometimes I think kids can see things differently, and maybe that's not always a bad thing." Thomas felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, something that hadn't happened during his years of service. The simple wisdom and kindness of this child was breaking through defenses he didn't even realize he had built. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope that his situation might not be as hopeless as it seemed. "What I'm thinking," George said, lowering his voice slightly, "is that maybe tomorrow morning before your shift starts, we could meet somewhere private where we could just talk like two people who care about each other. Would that be something you might want to do?" The offer was so unexpected and so generous that Thomas found himself nodding before his rational mind could intervene with objections about protocol and appropriateness. Something deep inside him desperately needed to accept this lifeline that was being offered by the most unlikely source. Yes, Your Royal Highness, I think I would like that very much," Thomas managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. George smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was: a kind, caring child who had noticed someone's pain and wanted to help. "Good," he said simply. "How about if we meet in the small garden behind the chapel at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning? It's usually quiet there, and we can sit on the bench under the oak tree." Thomas nodded again, amazed at how this young prince had thought through the practical details of their meeting. George was clearly intelligent beyond his years, but more importantly, he possessed a level of emotional maturity that allowed him to navigate complex social situations with grace and sensitivity. "There's one more thing," George added, his voice becoming slightly more serious. "I want you to know that whatever you tell me tomorrow will stay between us unless you specifically ask me to share it with someone who might be able to help. I understand that grown-ups sometimes have problems that are private, and I respect that." This assurance meant more to Thomas than George could possibly understand. The fear of his personal struggles becoming known throughout the royal household had been one of his greatest concerns. The prince's promise of confidentiality showed a level of understanding that many adults would not have demonstrated. As George prepared to continue his walk, he paused and looked directly at Thomas one more time. "I just want you to know that you're not alone," he said quietly. "Sometimes it might feel like you are, but you're not. There are people who notice you and care about what happens to you." With that, George continued on his walk, leaving Thomas standing at his post with a completely transformed perspective on his situation. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something other than despair and overwhelming pressure. He felt hope, and more importantly, he felt valued as a human being. The rest of Thomas's shift passed in a blur of mixed emotions. Part of him could hardly believe that the conversation had actually happened. Another part of him was already anticipating the meeting the next morning with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Most significantly, he felt a lifting of the crushing isolation that had been weighing on him for so long. That evening, as Thomas returned to his small shared flat, he found himself looking at his circumstances with new eyes. His problems hadn't disappeared, and his family's financial situation was just as dire as it had been that morning. However, something fundamental had changed. He no longer felt like he was facing these challenges completely alone. For the first time in weeks, Thomas was able to eat a proper dinner and get a full night's sleep. The knowledge that someone cared about his well-being, even if that someone was a 10-year-old prince, had provided him with a sense of peace he had forgotten was possible. Meanwhile, Prince George spent his evening thinking carefully about the conversation he would have with Thomas the next morning. He understood that this meeting represented a significant responsibility. Thomas was clearly struggling with serious problems, and George wanted to make sure he approached their discussion with the maturity and sensitivity that the situation required. George also spent time that evening talking with his parents about general principles of helping others in difficult situations. Without revealing any specifics about Thomas, he asked thoughtful questions about how to listen effectively, how to offer help without making someone feel like charity, and how to know when a problem was too big for one person to solve alone. Prince William and Catherine were impressed by their son's questions and provided him with guidance that would prove invaluable in the conversation to come. They emphasized the importance of listening without trying to immediately solve everything, of asking questions that allowed people to express their feelings, and of focusing on the person's strengths and dignity, rather than just their problems. As both George and Thomas prepared for sleep that night, neither could have predicted exactly how their meeting the next morning would unfold. However, both felt a sense of anticipation and hope that had been missing from their lives in recent days. They were about to discover that genuine human connection has the power to transform even the most difficult circumstances, and that sometimes the most profound help comes from the most unexpected sources. The stage was now set for a conversation that would not only change Thomas's immediate circumstances, but would also demonstrate the extraordinary capacity for wisdom and compassion that can exist in even the youngest hearts when they are guided by genuine care for others. The early morning air at Windsor Castle carried the fresh scent of dew on grass as Thomas Mitchell made his way to the small garden behind St. George's Chapel. It was 6:55 a.m., and despite having barely slept due to nervous anticipation, Thomas felt more alert and hopeful than he had in months. He had changed from his usual casual clothes into his best shirt and trousers, wanting to show respect for the unusual meeting he was about to have. As Thomas approached the designated meeting spot, he saw Prince George already seated on the wooden bench beneath the ancient oak tree. The young prince was dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, looking more like any other 10-year-old than a member of the royal family. This casual appearance immediately put Thomas more at ease, as it reinforced George's promise that this would be a conversation between two people rather than a formal royal audience. George looked up as Thomas approached and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Thomas," he said, using the guard's first name naturally. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Thomas settled onto the bench beside the prince, marveling at how surreal the situation felt. 24 hours earlier, he could never have imagined sitting casually beside a member of the royal family, preparing to discuss his personal problems. Yet here he was, and somehow it felt completely natural. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," George began, "and I want you to know that I asked my parents some questions about how to be a good listener. Not about you specifically," he added quickly, "but about how to help people when they're going through difficult times." Thomas was touched by the thought and preparation that George had put into this meeting. It demonstrated a level of maturity and consideration that many adults would not have shown. "Your Royal Highness, I have to say that what you're doing here is extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like this kindness from anyone, let alone someone in your position." George shook his head gently. "Please just call me George this morning. And you don't need to thank me for being kind. My great-grandmother always says that kindness should be as natural as breathing, especially when you have the ability to help someone." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. The simple request to use the prince's first name felt like an enormous gift, a gesture of equality and respect that he had never expected to receive. "All right, George," he said, testing the name carefully. "I suppose you want to know what's been troubling me." "Only if you want to tell me," George replied. "But I hope you do, because sometimes talking about problems makes them feel less scary and helps you think of solutions you might not have seen before." Taking a deep breath, Thomas began to share his story. He told George about his family in Manchester, about his father's recent illness and the mounting medical bills, about his sister's university expenses, and about his parents' mortgage struggles. He explained how he had been sending most of his salary home, leaving himself with barely enough to survive in London. As Thomas spoke, George listened with an intensity and focus that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a child. He asked thoughtful questions that helped Thomas clarify his feelings and concerns. Most importantly, he never once made Thomas feel judged or pitied. "So you've been carrying all of this by yourself," George said when Thomas finished his account. "That must feel incredibly heavy and lonely." Thomas nodded, surprised by how accurately the young prince had captured his experience. "It does feel heavy," he admitted. "Some days I wonder if I'm strong enough to keep carrying it all." George was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about his response. "You know," he said finally, "my father once told me that being strong doesn't mean carrying everything by yourself. He said that real strength sometimes means knowing when to ask for help and being brave enough to accept it when it's offered." These words resonated deeply with Thomas, who had been raised to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Hearing a different perspective from someone he respected began to shift his thinking about his situation. "I want to help you," George said simply, "not because I pity you, but because I think you're a good person who works really hard and deserves to have support when you need it. The question is, what kind of help would actually make a difference?" Thomas was stunned by the directness of the offer. "George, I can't possibly accept charity from your family. It wouldn't be right, and it would compromise my position." George nodded thoughtfully. "I understand why you might feel that way. But what if we could find a way to help that didn't feel like charity? What if we could create an opportunity for you to earn additional income, while still maintaining your dignity and your job?" This approach intrigued Thomas as it addressed his primary concern about accepting help. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," George said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm, "I've been learning about royal history and the stories of the guards and staff who have served our family over the centuries. Some of these stories are really fascinating, but a lot of them have never been properly recorded or shared with the public." Thomas wasn't sure where this was leading, but he was curious to hear more. George continued, "What if you could help me document some of these stories? You could interview other guards, research the history, and help me write articles or even a book about the real people behind the uniforms. It would be legitimate work that would benefit everyone, and you could be paid properly for it." The idea was brilliant in its simplicity and dignity. It would provide Thomas with additional income, while also creating something valuable for the royal family and the public. Most importantly, it would be real work that utilized Thomas's intelligence and communication skills, not just charity disguised as employment. That's an amazing idea," Thomas said, feeling a surge of excitement. "I would love to work on something like that. But would your parents approve of such a project?" George smiled. "I think they would be very interested, especially if I explained how it could help preserve important historical information, while also supporting the people who serve our family. But even if they needed some convincing, I think this is exactly the kind of project they would want to support." For the first time in months, Thomas felt genuinely excited about his future. The project George had suggested would not only provide financial relief, but would also give him an opportunity to contribute something meaningful beyond his regular duties. "There's something else," George added. "I think there might be other guards who are facing similar challenges. If this project works well, maybe we could expand it to include more people and create ongoing opportunities for additional income." Thomas was amazed by the comprehensive nature of George's thinking. The young prince had not only identified a solution to Thomas's immediate problem, but had also envisioned a way to help others in similar situations. It demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and social consciousness that was truly impressive. As their conversation drew to a close, both Thomas and George felt a sense of accomplishment and mutual respect. They had not only addressed a serious problem, but had done so in a way that preserved everyone's dignity, while creating something positive for the future. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in the same garden where his life had been transformed by a 10-year-old prince's compassion. But this time he was not alone with his struggles and worries. Instead, he was surrounded by fellow guards, royal staff members, and even some members of the royal family who had gathered to celebrate the launch of Guardians of History, the Untold Stories of Royal Service, the book project that had begun as George's spontaneous solution to Thomas's financial crisis had grown into something far more significant than anyone had initially imagined. What started as a way to help one struggling guard had evolved into a comprehensive program that not only preserved important historical stories but also created ongoing opportunities for staff members to supplement their income through research, writing, and educational activities. Thomas had thrown himself into the project with enthusiasm and dedication that impressed everyone involved. Working closely with Prince George, he had interviewed dozens of current and former guards, uncovering stories that spanned generations of royal service. Some stories were heroic, others were humorous, and many were simply touching accounts of ordinary people who had dedicated their lives to serving something larger than themselves. The collaboration between Thomas and George had been remarkable to witness. Despite the 40-year age difference and vastly different life experiences, the two had developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. George's natural curiosity and fresh perspective complemented Thomas's military discipline and growing research skills perfectly. Prince William and Catherine had initially been surprised by their son's proposal, but they quickly recognized the project's value on multiple levels. Not only would it preserve important institutional memory and create positive publicity for the royal household, but it would also demonstrate the family's genuine care for their staff in a meaningful and dignified way. The success of the initial project had led to the establishment of the Royal Heritage Foundation, a formal program that provided opportunities for staff members to participate in various educational and historical projects. The foundation offered paid positions for research, writing, public speaking, and educational outreach, all while allowing participants to maintain their regular duties. For Thomas personally, the transformation had been profound. The additional income from his work with the foundation had allowed him to help his family through his father's medical crisis without compromising his own basic needs. His sister Emma had been able to continue her university studies, and his parents had been able to keep their home while managing the medical expenses. More importantly, Thomas had discovered talents and interests he never knew he possessed. His natural storytelling ability and his skill at connecting with people had made him an excellent interviewer and writer. The project had opened up new career possibilities that he was beginning to explore, always with the support and encouragement of the royal family. The ripple effects of George's initial act of kindness had extended far beyond Thomas's individual situation. Several other guards had participated in the foundation's projects, finding both financial relief and personal fulfillment in the work. The program had also inspired similar initiatives in other royal households and institutions, creating a model for how employers could support their staff in meaningful ways. On this particular morning, as the book launch celebration continued around him, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. It all traced back to 5 simple words spoken by a compassionate child who had noticed his pain and cared enough to do something about it. Prince George, now 11 years old, had grown even more thoughtful and mature through his involvement in the project. The experience of working closely with Thomas and the other guards had given him insights into the lives and challenges of working people that would serve him well throughout his life. He had learned that true leadership meant paying attention to the needs of others and finding creative solutions that preserved everyone's dignity. The success of the foundation had also strengthened George's relationship with his parents and great-grandmother, all of whom had been impressed by his initiative and compassion. Queen Elizabeth in particular had praised George's approach to helping others, noting that he had instinctively understood principles that had taken her decades to learn. As the celebration continued, Thomas found himself in conversation with other guards who had participated in the foundation's projects. Many shared similar stories of financial stress and personal challenges that had been alleviated through their involvement. What struck Thomas most was how the program had not only provided financial assistance but had also created a sense of community and mutual support among the staff. One young guard named Sarah mentioned that working on the oral history project had helped her overcome her natural shyness and develop confidence in public speaking. Another guard, David, had discovered a passion for historical research that was leading him to consider pursuing additional education. The foundation had become more than just a source of supplementary income. It had become a pathway for personal growth and development. Later that afternoon, Thomas and George found themselves back on the bench under the oak tree where their friendship had begun. The scene was remarkably similar to that first morning 6 months earlier, but everything else had changed dramatically. Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't approached me that day? Thomas asked, looking at the young prince with genuine curiosity. George considered the question seriously before responding. I think about it sometimes, he said, but I don't really like to dwell on what might have been. I prefer to think about what we learned and what we can do next. This response perfectly captured the forward-looking optimism that had made George such an effective problem solver. Rather than seeking credit for past actions, he was always focused on future possibilities and continued improvement. What we learned, Thomas said thoughtfully, is that problems that seem impossible to solve by yourself often become manageable when someone else cares enough to help you think them through. George nodded. And we learned that helping people doesn't have to mean just giving them money or fixing their problems for them. Sometimes the best help is creating opportunities for people to use their own talents and strengths. As they sat together in comfortable silence, both Thomas and George understood that their story was about much more than solving one person's financial crisis. It was about the power of human connection to transform lives, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see people's true circumstances, and the remarkable things that can happen when compassion is combined with creativity and action. The book Guardians of History would go on to become a bestseller, with proceeds supporting the continued expansion of the Royal Heritage Foundation. But more importantly, it would serve as a testament to the idea that genuine care for others, regardless of age or social position, has the power to create lasting positive change. Thomas Mitchell had begun that year as a struggling guard carrying his burdens alone. He ended it as a published author, a valued member of a supportive community, and most significantly, as someone who had experienced firsthand the transformative power of human kindness, all because a 10-year-old prince had noticed his pain and asked 5 simple words. Would you like to talk about it? The story of Prince George and Thomas Mitchell would be retold many times over the years, inspiring others to notice the struggles of those around them and to respond with creativity, compassion, and respect for human dignity. It served as a reminder that true nobility is not about titles or wealth, but about the willingness to see others as fellow human beings deserving of care and support.